Ever since around 1800, for over 2 centuries, the world was dominated by, in the first instance, Europe. China was more or less invisible, divided, invaded, economically weak. It was not really part of most people's global map. It was ignored. It didn't need, really, to be noticed because its voice was simply too weak. The West set, well, in the first instance Europe, then the United States, set the parameters of the modern world. Modernity was synonymous with being Western. And then things began to change. The great turning point was 1949 and the Chinese Revolution, when China steadily began to put itself together again with remarkable success. But especially after 1978, when China began to grow at an extraordinary speed, over 10% a year for 35 years. And finally, the rest of the world began to wake up and take notice of this new phenomenon. It was the most dramatic economic change the world has ever seen. Now, the responses to this situation in the West or across the world varied. We've got one kind of response that we can now see from the United States and President Trump, which is to seek in whatever way to try and weaken China, stop its rise, even to reverse that process. But other responses have been more complicated, sometimes positive, sometimes more negative. Why negative? I think because it's a fear of the unknown. So this country, which represents 1/5 of humanity, they knew very little about. So that's one reason. But on the other hand, especially in the developing world, the extraordinary economic transformation of China and the willingness of China to extend the hand of help and friendship in the development of these countries has won, if you can look at all the opinion polls and so on from Africa and elsewhere, won the support and sympathy and enthusiasm of many people in the developing countries. Now, at this point, we're looking forwards and we're trying to imagine the future in a way we've never had to in the modern world, because the future has always been Western. But it's not going to be just Western. Well, I'll give you 6 points into how I think China is going to profoundly influence the world. The first is this: the most important change since 1945 is the rise of the developing countries, including China. In 1945, still most were colonized. Even by as late as the mid-1970s, they only represented 1/3 of global GDP, even though they represented well over, probably about 85% of humanity. But now the picture is very different, because the developing world now represents something like 60% of global GDP. What a transformation in, historically speaking, a very short space of time. We are looking at the possibility of what I would call a global order that is constituted by a majority of the world's population. Remember, the West only constitutes now less than 15% of the world. And what we now are looking at for the first time ever, well, certainly in modern times, is the idea of a global order which is no longer the creature and invention of a very small minority of the world. This would be, in my view, the most important act of democratization in the last 200 years. My second point is about war. You know, it's not true that China has never had wars. But after the unification of China in 221 BC. What is notable with regard to China is how few wars it's had. That across, for example, its region, with countries like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and so on, wars were actually extremely rare. It was a totally different history, for example, to the history of Europe, which was always fighting, constantly fighting. It was only by the middle of the 20th century that Europe actually stopped fighting like it had. And if you look at the present period, since China's economic rise, especially since 1978, what is remarkable about China's rise is how few wars have been fought. Now compare that with American history, or Japanese history, or British history, or French history, or German history. The rise of all these countries was characterized by wars of expansion and aggression. In fact, the only wars I can really think of that China's been involved in were essentially border wars, which are something completely different. I think that the rise of China will introduce a new sense of the importance and possibility of peace in the world compared with the situation that's prevailed in the age of the West. Third point, statecraft, governance. Now, often in the West, certainly when we talk about governance, they only talk about the way in which governments are elected. They don't talk about the efficacy of government. What is it capable of doing? Can it grow the economy? Can it increase people's living standards? Can it maintain a degree of harmony in society? And so on. And when it comes to the competence of governance, then in my view, China sets utterly different standards to those that have prevailed in the West. And I'll give you one example of this. Let's face it, China is the world leader in the construction of infrastructure. The West has more or less actually given up on this. It hardly does any infrastructure now. If you've been to America recently, you'll see what the state of the infrastructure is, or my own country in the UK, and so on. And the important thing about infrastructure is that it is about looking forwards. It's about thinking where your society is going. And secondly, it's about looking after not just the individual, but the society as a whole, of seeing society as an entity rather than simply a set of segments or a set of interest groups and so on. My fourth point, it's about race, it's about ethnicity. The Chinese think of themselves as over 90% Han. But of course, historically, China was the product of many different races, many different races, an unimaginable number of races given the size of China, both geographically and demographically. And China, because of its long history in part, has had a long process of intermixing and melding of different races, to the point now where the vast majority think of themselves as Han. Now, I can't think of another example in the world, even big countries or small countries, where this is really the case. And the way in which the Chinese think of themselves as Han is not primarily, or even really at all, as a racial category, but it's a cultural category. And this, I think, is extremely important. And you remember that two of the last three dynasties were not Han. One was Mongolian, and the last one was Manchurian. So I think this is so different from the history of the West and the history of nation states, which their very creation was one of exclusivity around a dominant race. China sets a new kind of example, which I think we can all learn from. I'm not saying China's perfect in this respect, but it's got a very interesting historical example for the rest of the world. My fifth point, China's history. One of the things that the rise of China is doing is redefining how we think about history. The West thinks history started with the rise of the West, in other words, somewhere, say, around the late 1700s, early 19th century. For China, history did not start so recently. China will go back, first thing Chinese will say to you is 5,000 years of civilization, or even just since 221 BC and the Qin dynasty, 2,000 years of civilization. So the Chinese look at all these questions like the South China Sea in a completely different way from the way in which the West looks at history. See, one of the characteristics of China, of course, there's been the rise and fall of dynasties and so on. But I think overriding this, or primary in relationship to this, is the continuity of China. Extraordinary continuity. Today, you still regard the great sages like Confucius and Mencius and many others as very relevant to your debates in China about what's happening and where to go and how to behave and how to govern and so on. What this represents is a kind of new kind of wisdom. Right, my sixth point is about globalization. China is a great believer in globalization. It's been a huge beneficiary from globalization. China's approach to globalization has essentially been inclusive. Who were the greatest beneficiaries, in my view, in China from globalization? It was over half the population that were lifted out of poverty. That's a very different picture from the way globalization worked in the United States. A large part of the population, maybe as much as 30 or 40%, essentially were left out from the benefits of globalization. That is essentially, I think, politically why you've got the move towards protectionism in the United States. China has a fifth of the world's population. It's not just a country. It's not even just a continent. Running China is running a large slice of humanity, running a large slice of the global system. And therefore, it has an understanding, an intuition, an insight into the nature of globalization in a way that is quite different from the much smaller nation states which prevail, for example, in the West. And looking into the future, the Chinese, I think, quite rightly see globalization as an unstoppable trend. Thank you very much.
这就是中国，听张维为说。